Hi, welcome to Constitutional Chats, hosted by me, Janine Turner,
and Kathy Gillespie,
with students
Dakari Chapman
and me, Tova Kaplan.
Join us as we discuss hot topic issues with constitutional experts. It's sponsored by Constituting America.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Constitutional Chats. We are so excited that you're with us. Just come on in. We are going to be starting here in just a few minutes, but we want to make a few introductions. And while we're doing those introductions, we're going to ask Aubry if she'll put up a poll of our audience to find out who's with us today, whether we have elementary school, middle school, high school, if you're a parent or grandparent with children, teacher, if you'll answer our poll, we would be so appreciative. Now, our topic today is immigration, Ellis Island, and today, and we are so excited to have Professor Vincent Cannato with us today. And before we get to Professor Cannato's introduction, I want to recognize some of the other panelists that we have with us. First of all, we have actress Janine Turner, who is our founder and co-president and moderator of Constitutional Chats. And Janine, we're so excited that you're going to be moderating today. Janine is famous for her role as Maggie O'Connell in television's Northern Exposure. She's the founder and co-president of Constituting America, which she launched in 2010. And Janine is still acting, but she's also actively teaching kids about the U.S. Constitution, having given over 620 speeches to over 42,000 adults and students in classrooms across the country. So thank you, Janine, for all you do to bring the Constitution to life for students all over our nation. We also—
Hi, everybody. You can't see me though, because there's that pole over my face. I'll take that down for a second. There you go. Hi, everyone. Yeah, my camera's in a different place today. I got to figure this out. Hi, everybody.
We also have with us today Tova Kaplan. Tova is a 17-year-old student from Chicago, Illinois. She's a three-time winner of the We the Future contest, is the National Youth Director of Constituting America, and runs the Youth Advisory Board. Tova is passionate about inspiring young people to know and use their constitutional rights. Tova, would you like to say hello?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here as always. I'm excited to delve into the topic, and thank you to Janine and Kathy for making this possible.
Now we also have, thank you, Tova. We also have Jewel and Jorn Gilbert with us today. Jewel is executive producer and Jorn is operations director of Sing for America, a family-based company that the brothers co-founded. Sing for America seeks to show the art of truth and light through live performance. Both are proud We the Future contest winners. Jewel and Jorn are graduates of Moravian College, where they each earned a BA in musical performance and dramatic production. Jewel and Jorn, would y'all like to say hello?
Hello, everyone. Very glad to be here again and really dive into some Ellis Island talk. Looking forward to it for a while. I can't wait to hear what our special guest has to say.
Great.
Yes.
And I also want to introduce Aubry Jackman, our media director. Aubry's responsible for all this fabulous technology. Aubry is this year's We the Future Best College STEM winner. She's born and raised in Utah and the middle of 7 children. Aubry is a Brigham Young University student and aspires to be an athletic coach. Aubry, would you like to say hello and maybe give us the results of our poll?
Yes, definitely. Hello, and so happy to be here. So we have 35% friends with us today, 24% fans, 12% family, another 12% of parent and grandparents with children, and 18% teachers. So we're so glad that all of you are here with us today.
Well, great. Thank you, Aubry. And before I introduce Professor Cannato, I want to recognize our sponsor for today, which is actually the entire Gillespie family. The Gillespie family has made this sponsorship in memory of their dad, Mr. Jack Gillespie, who came over in 1929 to this country from Ireland at the age of 8 on a steamboat called the Letitia. Mr. Gillespie went on to serve his country as an infantry platoon leader. His calves were shot off in the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, and he was awarded a Bronze Star and a Silver Star by the age of 25. Mr. Gillespie rose to the rank of Tech Sergeant, and he is buried with his wife, Connie, in a veterans cemetery in New Jersey. So we thank the veterans, we thank the Gillespie family for sponsoring this episode today in memory of Mr. Jack Gillespie. And we also invite our audience, if you have relatives that came over through Ellis Island, please put them in the question and answer queue, and we'll be sure and read their names and say a little bit about them. So now I'd like to introduce our very special guest, Professor Vincent Cannato. Vincent J. Cannato is Associate Professor of History at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where he teaches courses on New York City history, Boston history, immigration history, and 12th century American history. He's the author of the book American Passage, The History of Ellis Island, which we all are very proud to have. He's also the co-editor of Living in the 80s at Oxford University Press 2009. Professor Canado has written for numerous publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Post, New York Daily News, National Affairs, Politico, Humanities Magazine, the Weekly Standard, and the New Republic. He's also been recipient of a Public Scholars Fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Professor Canado received his PhD in history from Columbia University and his BA with honors in political science from Williams College. Welcome, Professor Canado.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you for having me here. Yeah, happy to be here and happy to talk about Ellis Island with you, and I look forward to hearing your questions. Let me start off with just a brief overview of Ellis Island. When we talk about Ellis Island, we're talking about a relatively small island in New York Harbor, between the island of Manhattan and New Jersey. And from 1892 until 1954, it operated as an immigration inspection station, the largest such inspection station in the country. And during its peak years from 1892 to the 1920s, about 12 million immigrants came through Ellis Island. The purpose of the island was to process immigrants and to, as I found out, these terms came out to sort of separate out desirable immigrants from undesirable immigrants. And what that meant was Congress had passed laws, categories of immigrants that would not be allowed into the country. There are a number of categories. Some had to do with health, some had to do with being anarchists, later on being illiterate. So Ellis Island was the processing place that would inspect these immigrants to see whether they were able to enter the country legally. And there was a big inspection process that was created at Ellis Island to get these waves of immigrants. And there were the height of immigration, 1907 saw about 1 million immigrants come through Ellis Island just in that 1 year of 1907. And some days had 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 immigrants coming in one day. So obviously you couldn't do a full interview medical exam for every one of the immigrants. So they had to be processed down through a line, sort of a single file line where inspectors and doctors would look at them, examine them very quickly, and then pass them on, or if there was a problem, put them aside for further inspection or a further review. 80% of immigrants who came through Ellis Island got through in a matter of a couple of hours. Only 20% were put aside for more medical, for a hearing or for a medical inspection or an intelligence test or anything else. And then only less than 2% of all immigrants were ended up being excluded from Ellis Island. Some had to be detained for a while, a few days, a couple of weeks, for some a couple of months, for very rare cases, a couple of years. But ultimately, if you got to Ellis Island, 98% plus of people who got there eventually got into the country. And the One reason for that was that immigrants were inspected before they got to Ellis Island, and we could talk about that more. They were inspected over in European ports before they could buy a ticket. So in order for them to purchase a ticket to come over, they had to pass an inspection. The reason for this is that the steamship companies were put on the hook for every immigrant they brought over. If they brought an immigrant over who got sent back, they would have to pay a fine and pay to send that person back. So it was in their economic interest not to bring over anyone who would be rejected by American immigration officials. Who were the immigrants who came over? For the most part, these are immigrants, European immigrants, and mostly Southern and Eastern European immigrants. The big immigration groups in the early 20th century were Italian, Russian Jews for the most part, and those from sort of Central Europe. Those were the three big immigration groups. But there were also immigrants that came in from the Caribbean, these are Black immigrants who came in from Jamaica or Barbados. There were immigrants coming from the Middle East, from places like Lebanon, Turkey, Syria. For the most part, these were Christian and Jewish immigrants, not Muslim immigrants. So although most of the immigrants were from Europe, there were still a number of immigrants who came from Middle East or came from the Caribbean. Immigrants from Asia is sort of a different story, and we can talk about that perhaps later in our question and answers. So with that brief overview, I'll leave it there and open it up to your questions.
Janine.
Hi. Yes. Hi, Professor Canado. Great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So I was jotting down a few notes. Can you say the three main countries again? It was Europe and where else?
Yeah, the three main countries: Italy, Russia, and that was mostly Russian Jews, and Central Europe.
Italy.
The Austro-Hungarian Empire. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Interesting. I did the math just so we could have some perspective. You said 2% were sent back. If 1 million came in 1 year, 2% of those would have been 20,000. 20,000 were actually sent back. And there's some things that, and first of all, we're so glad you're here with us today. There's some things that I think are just good for us to understand, because there's a romanticism around Ellis Island. And there's a comparison today. What are we doing today? When everything we're doing today is so horrible. And in Ellis Island, it was also wonderful. And what I believe in is, of course, I believe in ethics, and I believe in logic. You know, there's ethics and morality, and then there's logic. How are we going to make this happen? And what happens today is we get caught up in this sort of clickbait thing that becomes hysterical, and we don't really understand the facts. So it's fascinating that that 2% were sent, because I had someone say to me, nobody was sent back from Ellis Island ever. And I said, well, that's just not what I understood it to be. So people were actually sent back. It's also interesting that people were vetted in another country before they could come over. Did you say that those countries that vetted the people before they came over were responsible if they were, okay, they paid the fee?
The steamship companies. So these were the boats that took immigrants over. Those steamship companies are the ones that sort of interviewed and inspected immigrants over in Europe. They're the ones.
They had to pay a fee if someone came over. All right. So I think that's really interesting, because that's what, and I'm not bringing politics into this. This is just a fact. That's what President Trump was trying to do when he had the people from Colombia coming from South America get to Mexico. He was asking them to stay in Mexico and wait before they came into America to make sure that they were legitimately needing asylum. So that's kind of a similar thing, isn't it? Another country was vetting them before they came through.
Yeah, although these aren't, remember, it's not countries. These are the companies. So the steamship company.
Same concept, which is have someone else.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And there were fines. So the steamship companies would have been fined if they brought someone over who couldn't pass inspection.
Okay, really interesting. And for all I know, I had someone come across. I mean, I think on my father's side, they were here much sooner because I'm a daughter of the American Revolution. But on my my mother's side, AG, were Huguenots. So were Huguenots during this time? The big
Those have been earlier. Those have been 1700.
Okay, so I may have been here a lot earlier than that. But also, Kathy, I want to hear about your father-in-law whose leg calves were shot off. That's the story. I want to hear that. Okay, so I guess my question for you is, and I'll turn it over to everybody else, I just think knowledge is power. Let's make our decisions when we have 2 points of view and understand what's going on. The 20% that were sent back, why were they sent back?
2%. 20,000.
20,000, 2%.
Right. So the main category, I think half of all people sent back were sent back because they were deemed likely to become a public charge. And this phrase came back in the Trump administration where it's always been in the law, but they kind of re-emphasized that. It's a complicated term, but half of those were sent back. The others would have been medical issues. Another one, there were contract laborers, people who came over with contracts. This is another complicated issue. Anarchists, people who were, there was intelligence tests at a certain point. Those who were deemed quote unquote imbeciles, it was called, or idiots. This is what the law said. The law said no one deemed an idiot or imbecile could enter the country. So you have very early intelligence testing done at Ellis Island. So these are some, but for the most part, it's medical stuff and also likely to become a public charge.
And that certainly doesn't matter today if you're a public charge. And now we hand out the money.
It's, yeah, I mean, that's, the idea was an immigrant was supposed to take care of himself or herself. And that's always been on the books. It's just not always enforced. And especially in recent years, it has not been enforced.
And what was the medical condition it was something about the eye. It was one of them was an eye condition. Tell us about that.
Trachoma was the eye condition. It was sort of a kind of like conjunctivitis. There was an inflammation on the back of your eyelid, and it would get very grainy and rough, so that as you blinked, it would scratch your cornea and would eventually lead to blindness. It still exists today. Has not been eradicated, but today we at least have antibiotics, which didn't exist at this time. So a lot of immigrants who were sent back for trachoma, and there was an eye test where they would flip your eyelid back to look at the back of your eyelid and to see if there was inflammation back there. And that became a very infamous test at Ellis Island. So yeah, trachoma was a big one. Yeah.
If you had that, you weren't allowed to heal and go back. If you had that, you just had to go back, right?
No, you were allowed to heal. You were definitely there. Ellis Island also had a hospital.
Could you heal? Could you heal from that disease?
So it's like today, it's
the chest or whatever. It became a big deal.
It's the treatment was horrific. It involved like scrubbing of the back of the eyelid. I mean, it was an awful, yeah. But they did try to heal people with it. And I guess if you had a very mild version of it, it might have worked. But yeah, from what I've read, it did not sound like a very pleasant treatment.
And if you didn't heal from it, you were sent back.
Exactly, yeah.
And last question, what were some of the other diseases where they sent people back?
Well, so the big diseases, when big diseases are like cholera, tuberculosis, typhus, typhoid fever, by 1900, you don't have many people coming over because they're being weeded out over in Europe. They can't get on a ship in the first place. So what you have are these more minor diseases like trachoma. The other one was something called favus, which was a disease of the scalp. It was like a fungal disease that caused you to lose your hair. It wasn't serious, but it was something that inspectors could see pretty easily. Those turned out to be the two biggest diseases people were sent back for. But there were always some tuberculosis cases. There were always some other medical issues that came about.
So they were sent back for stuff in their hair, whatever that was you just said. Not to say the word stuff. I hate stuff. Can you say that word again, please? And I can say it intelligently back to you.
Or favus.
Favus.
F-A-V-U-S.
So those with favus were sent back. Okay, interesting. I just didn't want to be on record as using the word stuff. Okay, well, that's all really interesting. And I'm going to turn it over to Tonya. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is really fascinating. My family came through Ellis Island, so it's great to hear about. Yeah, and so I was just wondering, hearing about Ellis Island, how I guess efficient the immigration process was, how they were able to process so many people so quickly and get the results of whether they could come to America so quickly, and accepting 98% of people in, which seems unimaginable today. So just contrasting Ellis Island to today, I looked up the average waiting time for a naturalization decision is 15 months, like the process to get naturalized in America, and for many it's many years today. So why is it so much longer and more complicated today versus during Ellis Island?
Good question. First, naturalization wasn't done at Ellis Island, just so so naturalization is the process of becoming a citizen, and that would have been done after. The decision to come in at Ellis Island was just the decision to enter the country. But you're right that the process is very long, even just to get into the country. I think we don't realize there are millions of people out in the world who are sort of quote unquote waiting in line to come into America, who want to come to America, and some of them have to wait years. Today we have a different system of immigration. You enter the country by getting a visa, and you have to qualify for that visa mostly through having family members who are already here. I think 2/3 of all legal immigrants come because they have a relative already here. And then about 1/4 of immigrants come because they get a skilled workers visa. About 10% come because they're refugees. So if you don't qualify for one of those, it's very, very hard to get in. And it's much more of a bureaucratized process than it was in the past. So yeah, as long as you got to Ellis Island and could make it through, you were in, and that was pretty much it. Today, it's much more of a long process where you have to apply for a visa, get approved for a visa, you have to prove that you're eligible for the visa, and then you come over, and then you have to go through the naturalization process, which is another process down the road.
So why the change? What happened just in our politics and in our history that necessitated that change in policy?
Yeah, I just want to step in. I just want to step in and connect the dots here. You said coming in was all Ellis Island was about, but the naturalization process took longer. So we can really get a good grip on Tova's wonderful question. How long did naturalization? Let's compare apples and apples, not apples and oranges. How long did naturalization take? Do you know? In those days. So it might have taken 50 minutes for someone to be naturalized in those days.
It might have. Well, no matter what, whether it's 100 years ago today, there's a waiting period from the time you enter the country to the time you get naturalized. And I believe it's 5 years, either 5 or 7, but it's 5 years. And then you can apply. I don't know what the waiting time was 100 years ago to become natural, for your papers to get processed.
That'd be the question. So we compare those two things, because it sounds like getting in is one thing and naturalization. Okay, Tova, sorry, go ahead. I was just making sure we had a cohesive answer.
Yes, but the difference between now and back then is that we had new laws that came in. We had, in the 1920s, there were quota laws. So starting in the 1920s, every country had its own quota. So if you wanted to come to America, you had to qualify under the quota. And some countries had big quotas, some countries had small quotas. That begins in the 1920s. And that goes until the 1960s. And then there's another change in the 60s in the 65 Immigration Act. And that's where you get the family reunification, you get skilled worker visas. So there was no, as long in 1900, as long as you wanted to come to the country and you weren't in one of those categories, like, a pauper or someone of low intelligence or likely to become a public charge or sick, you could come in. But today we have these rules. You can only come in if you have a family member here, you qualify for a skilled worker visa, you're a refugee, and it's a very small number of refugees, or there's a diversity lottery, which is for anyone who doesn't qualify for those other things, and they come from a country that doesn't have a lot of immigrants already here. Your application goes into a big lottery, and they pick out somewhere around 50,000 every year. But I think they get 1 million applicants every year. So as you can see, it's a much more complicated system today. And that means there's longer wait times. You need lawyers, a lot more lawyers to get through the system often. It's quite a bit different. It's become and our society has become more complex, right? Everything has become more bureaucratized. It's just, even with our technology, there's just a lot more rules and a lot more steps and processes.
Thank you. And then just looking at Ellis Island, why was there such a spike in immigration during its peak years, especially from those regions specifically where people are coming in?
Oh, good question. It's mostly because it coincides with the second industrial revolution. This is the era of factories. The American economy is just booming. America is starting to become the preeminent industrial power beginning in the late 1800s into the 1900s. So all of these mines and factories, they all needed laborers, unskilled, semi-skilled workers. So there was a great demand for immigrant labor. And you had immigrants who were looking, oftentimes in their homelands, they weren't doing very well. It wasn't a good time in Italy. Russian Jews were leaving Russia because there were pogroms, there was anti-Semitic attacks, so they wanted to leave. And you had, so there was two things, we call them push and pull factors. Immigrants are pushed out of their country by certain factors, and they're pulled to America by certain factors. But yeah, this is a time when the U.S. economy is being really transformed through industrialism.
Right. Fascinating. And then I just want to look at like other countries at the time, because we talk a lot about, how America at the time was very welcoming to immigrants. But comparatively, how were other countries treating immigrants? Was America uniquely, open, or were all countries kind of having a similar policy of anyone can come in?
Well, not all countries, but this is another good point where there are lots of people on the move in the late 1800s, early 1900s, all around the world. Many of them are coming to the United States, but you have other immigrants going to Canada, going to Australia, going to South America. Countries like Brazil and Argentina take in immigrants. You have immigrants going to England. So people are on the move, they're moving a lot. Many of them are going to the US, but they're also going to some of these other countries as well. I mean, a country like Argentina has a completely wide open policy of immigration at this time. They're seeking immigrants to come in and remake their society. And lots of Argentinians today descend from Italian immigrants and Spanish immigrants and Scottish immigrants of this period. Australia had a lot of immigration. Canada had a lot of immigration. Brazil. So yeah, these countries saw, not all, but there were definitely countries that also saw immigration during this time.
Thank you. I think I pass to the next person.
All right, so the Ellis Island discussion is always so cool because I think we told the last guy we talked to about it as well. And when we think of American immigration, we have this idea of the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island, and it's the icon that we look to, whether it was like that earlier or it's been like that since. It's what's burned into our cultural kind of memory like that. What was the philosophical change? I know that there was practical changes that brought about the end of Ellis Island. We talked about the wars and things like that, but we never picked back up that philosophical idea. Maybe it was just economic because there weren't the same skilled, there weren't the same type of industries boom, so there wasn't the need for the labor, but it couldn't have all just been practical. What changed? How has it not gone back at all? What is your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, so when you say change, you mean what we talked about in the 1920s with the quota laws, when we kind of move away from the old Ellis Island? Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, yes. Last time we talked a little bit about the factors which cut off the immigration, and we talked about how, there's practical reasons for it because because America is only America if it's American, also the economy has to be able to support every immigrant. So it's not like you can just allow an endless stream of immigrants into a finite amount of space. It's not possible. But it also seems like the idea has changed too. Presently, we talk about the hot button issue, of course, the illegal immigration and people coming over the border, but we ignore the point and the factor that the whole process is so different, and it's different in a way that doesn't really hold to the same ideals of the Ellis Island ideal, because even in the Ellis Island ideal, the thought was that those immigrants were helping the country to an extent, but we still also didn't have that same bureaucracy like we talked about. So it just seems like we're very far away from the process and the idea.
Yeah, I mean, it's good question. Thanks. We definitely have seen since the late 60s an increase in immigration, right? And now we're almost on par with immigration from the early 1900s. We have about 1 million legal immigrants every year, and we've had that for at least the last 20 years. It's not quite the same for a lot of different reasons, but I mean, I still think that there are people that think that immigration is a positive, legal immigration is a positive to American society. It's a positive influence.
We seem to speak of it more so from like a human rights standpoint now. So the concept now seems to be as if, the founding fathers and the way the country was set up, they didn't believe there was anyone's right to come into the country necessarily. They believed it was the country's right as sovereign to control immigration. And the discussion we have now, and Ellis Island didn't violate that idea either, I don't think. And the discussion now is more so centered around as if whether those immigrants have a right or not to come, not so much about,
No, that's a really good point. And some of this is tied up with human rights ideas. You mentioned human rights before. The 1945, I think it's 45, there's a human rights convention, and they talk about the rights of migrants. And someone has a right to leave their country. The big question is, do they have a right to come into a country? And that was kind of left ambiguous, but that's sort of what we're debating today. Is there a right to enter the country? I want to go back though and point out one change. Another thing about Ellis Island was that it was the beginning of federal immigration policy. Before Ellis Island, immigration was left up to individual states. And there was much less of an inspection, much less of a process before Ellis Island. So it's almost like there was an evolution from late 1700s down to the 1800s of not quite free immigration, but mostly free immigration. There was some state inspections involved, meaning state like New York or Massachusetts or New Jersey. And then Ellis Island federalizes it, and there's more of an inspection, and then we get to the quotas. But that's the debate today, is that, who has a right to come into the country? But back during the Ellis Island period, I found this was a debate back then as well, right? Commissioners of Ellis Island argued there is no right for a person to come into the country. And others would argue, yes, that people had a right to come in. So I think it's been more of a debate over time as well. And that's the key. Who gets to come in? Not everyone can come in, as you said. There are millions and millions and millions of people out there who are waiting for a chance to come into America. And we can take millions. Yeah.
And in some of what we've discussed on the show before, it's the ideas kind of emerged where it just seems like a sovereign nation can't grant outside individuals as a right to enter and then still be a sovereign nation. And it seems as if the more that people have assumed the right of the immigrant, the worse it's actually gotten for the immigrant. Because yes, while we have so much, like you said, we have 1 million, we're on par with the 20s, you said. I mean, that's pretty amazing. And it's great that people want to come here. But at the same time, the process to me seems much more unfair, because I know a lot of people who have tried to do it the legal way and from all different countries. And it's not just when we have, if you can get here, there's ways of staying here. But at the same time, if you want to try to do it the legal way, you can't. And we're here, you know, in college campus or at the political debate forum talking about whether this person has the right to come. It makes it really hard to be a sovereign nation. And it seems like it also has made the process more unfair.
Yeah, no, I think your point is right. On the one hand, it is really difficult. The legal immigration process is difficult. It's not easy to do. And if you know of anyone, like you said, you know, people have been through it. It's a challenge. And on the other hand, there are people who kind of circumnavigate that, who go around that. And that is a challenge to sovereignty. I think that's certainly true, that we've had that problem. So we have a system, you know, we have this like two-tiered system. On the one hand, it's really hard to go in the legal way. But on the other hand, we have people who come in, and a lot of the people who come in illegally are already here in the country legally. So they're usually here on student visas or work visas, and those visas expire, and then they stay in the country and they remain in the country. There's a large number of people who are illegal immigrants or undocumented, whatever term you want to use, who come in legally and then overstay their visas. That's a big issue. Yeah, and I'm all for it. You have to have, the lesson from Ellis Island is that you have to have some kind of a system where you can funnel immigrants in and make sure that people are coming in or meet whatever standards apply, so that you control your borders, right? And that the American citizen is confident that we're getting immigration, but we're getting a reasonable immigration that respects the rights of people who are coming in, right? Doesn't make it too difficult, but also doesn't make it too easy. So that's,
And we had
the key.
And we had a discussion too, just about how unique we are, that you can become, when you immigrate, you become an American. An American is an ideal, and it's not true of those other countries, because our land is just a unique land on the earth as far as that concept of the American idea is what makes us American to an extent. Though I did one particular question of, I was wondering when you said about the fines for the ship, for the companies that actually brought the people over. Do you know of the kind of how that economic system worked for those companies? Did the individuals pay their way, and they try, and, you know, were companies out there trying to get immigrants as if so that they could, you know, collect and bring the people over? How did that, do you know anything about that?
Yeah, no, it was business. It was a big business. These are major steamship companies, you know, the White Star and the Cunard Line and all those are the British ones. There were German fleets, and they were in the business of making money, and they charged, you know, it was just like today with a plane ticket. You had to buy a steamship ticket to come over if you were an immigrant. And so they charged a ticket. The US government would add a tax, a head tax on top of it that would go towards to the federal government to fund the immigration service. And yeah, there were also people out there in Europe trying to drum up, trying to get people to buy tickets, steamship tickets, to come to America. It was big business. It certainly was. And these were big companies involved in the transatlantic steamship travel. So yeah, so the immigration aspect of it, that was big business. They were making money off these immigrants.
Do you have something?
Yeah. So it seems like the idea of Ellis Island and that hub was very successful. Why do you think that idea of a hub, I mean, obviously a physical destination that all immigration will go through, there's no question where you came from, you know, why do you think that idea has left? Let's just say this, even, you know, what if you put 3 hubs? You have 3 mainstays, three central areas that is where every immigrant comes through. Why do you think we've moved on from that idea?
Good question. It's one, it's the difference between steamship travel and air travel. So steamship, and we're going to a limited number of ports, right? So these immigrants were coming by boat. They're going to a limited number of ports, mostly on the East Coast, a little bit San Francisco, New Orleans, Galveston, and these ports the reason we talk about Ellis Island is 75% of all immigrants came through New York. They were all coming through this one port, 75% of them in 1 year. But today with airplane travel, you can go through dozens of airports. You can come, do international flights. And you'd have to sort of restrict. I'm not even sure how the logistics of restricting international flights to just 3 hubs. All airports that do international travel have customs offices, right? That's customs. You arrive, whether you're an immigrant or not, you have to go through customs. That's part of the process. I think logistically, it would be really hard to say, okay, if you want to emigrate to America, you have to come through one of these 3 airports, for instance. I'm not sure that would really put a crimp in international travel, because you'd have other non-Americans, non-citizens traveling through the airports. Let's say traveling through, I don't know, pick an international airport. They would still need to be processed through customs. So I just think the logistics of modern travel would make this, even if you had three, I couldn't imagine how that would work.
Well, also though, I wouldn't be talking about any international travel. This would be just purely for immigrants, long-term. This is a long-term stay. So
before like granting the visa.
This isn't for green card. You're coming for set amount of time, coming back. What?
Nothing. Yeah.
This isn't for that. I just mean purely to immigrate. And
right.
If you travel to a different airport, I mean, you can go there, but you can't go through the process of immigration at that different airport. You can't, if I have a hub in California, well, I can't just go to Jacksonville and get the job done there. I have to find my way to California to do it correctly. So it wouldn't be all international travel. That would be fine, because there's obviously too much to downgrade that to just 3 areas.
I forgot the other reason why it's different, because today we have a system of visas. So beginning in 1924, we had the beginnings of a visa system. So prior to 1924, you didn't need a paperwork to get into the country. From 1924 down to our time, the way you get into the country is you apply for a visa in your home country at the American consulate. So the primary inspection is now done in the American consulates abroad. If you pass and you qualify for a visa, they will give you the visa, and you show up to America. When you go to customs, you say, I've got a visa to enter. So I think that's the main difference, the other difference, that it's just, it moves the inspection not in America, it moves the inspection abroad to the American consulates abroad.
Gotcha.
So the idea was that would cut, only people arriving in the country would have the right to arrive. Now, maybe that's an outdated concept, I don't know, but that's how it's been the last 100 years.
And then in the beginning, you kind of whet our appetites with your idea. You said about Asian immigrants, and you might bring that up later. I just wanted to know, it seemed like you had somewhere to go with that, and I was interested in what your thoughts were.
So for the immigration laws in the late 1800s, early 1900s, these were for European immigrants and other immigrants, not for Asian immigrants. Beginning in 1882, you have the Chinese Exclusion Act, which excludes most Chinese immigrants. So from 1882, and then you get, in the early 1900s, you get an exclusion of Japanese immigrants. And then by the 1920s, you have an exclusion of all Asian immigrants. So Asian immigrants were almost put in a different category, and it was actually harder to get into the country for Asian immigrants at this time. So that's why, and this mostly, there weren't that many Asian immigrants coming through Ellis Island. Most of them came through San Francisco or Western ports. But they were under almost a different under a different set of laws for emigrating into the country.
And would you say those were much more strict then? Could there, after the Exclusion Acts, could you still come over?
At all?
It was just much less, and they could come over, or was it just a full kibosh was put on the complete Asian immigration?
Not quite a full kibosh, but close. So for Chinese exclusion, you could come over if you had a parent who was here already, and you could come over if you were a businessman. The ban was actually against Chinese laborers. But what that did is it shrunk down the number of Chinese immigrants pretty dramatically. There were still some coming over every year, but it was much, much, much harder to get in.
Gotcha.
And why is that?
The explanation I give is twofold. One is economic. A lot of it comes out of kind of labor unions that are beginning to get strong in the late 1800s and are fearful of low-paid Chinese workers being imported in to work on the railroads and do other manual labor. And the other is racial. It was believed that Chinese immigrants could not assimilate. They were just too different from white Americans to assimilate into the country. And therefore, it would be best to just stop the immigration.
You know, I'm going to go to Kathy and our listeners. But can you tell us, and I have three other questions I'll try to tag on at the end, but I'm not going to do it now. Can you tell us if people were trying to get in through Mexico back then and the Asia Pacific? I mean, people must have been coming over on boats. Not everyone went all the way around to Ellis Island.
Yeah, there were ports. So the port of San Francisco was a receptive port for the West Coast. New Orleans, Galveston, these were ports coming through. You didn't have other boat. I mean, I think you're kind of thinking about the boat people, like the Vietnamese boat people in the 70s. You didn't really have that back then, but you did have people going across the border, whether it's the Canadian border or the Mexican border. And technically they were supposed to go to an immigration station to kind of fill out paperwork to enter the country. The issue with Mexican immigrants is going to be a little different in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, because you have guest worker programs that are allowing, after the quotas, are allowing Mexican workers to come in to do work on a temporary guest worker basis. And that becomes a big issue in the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s. But you did not like today. You didn't have, but there was issues of border crossings and how to deal with that.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Because we all just think Ellis Island. Everyone went through Ellis Island. And when you said we're talking about Jordan's question about the airplanes coming, all of a sudden I started thinking, well, wow, yeah, there were people in the Chinese, people coming from the Pacific and in the South and the North, and how was that handled? That's food for thought. Okay, Kathy.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Canado. And we've got so many of our listeners who have great Ellis Island stories. And I just want to go through a few of them real quick. Robert Brescia writes that Antonio and Maria Brescia, his grandparents, came to the U.S. in 1920 aboard the USS Taormina. Grandpa was a great American and lived to the age of 109. And then Anita Cooper writes, my grandmother, Marie Lindbergh, age 25, came through Ellis Island from Denmark in 1909. No other relatives came with her. My grandfather, Hoffman Peterson, age 17, came through Castle Garden in 1880 from Denmark. They met and married in Fargo, North Dakota in 1910. And then Michael Amowitz writes, my father's family came through Ellis Island in 1904 to 1906 from what is now Cobrin, Belarus, joining other family in Lynchburg, Virginia, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. My father's father was a carpenter by trade, and I recovered his arrival date and information through Ancestry in only 3 days in 2002. And as a result, Michael was able to spend the day at Ellis Island on the 100th anniversary of his arrival with some knowledge of his experience that day. So those are just some great stories from our listeners. And then Dwayne Horner has a question, writes in and asks, was Ellis Island any different than Angel Island in California as far as immigration goes? And does the internment camps that happened play any role in immigration that happened during World War II?
All right, two separate issues. Yes, Angel Island is sometimes called the Ellis Island of the West Coast. It's a federal immigration inspection processing center. So they processed all immigrants coming through San Francisco. Many of them were Chinese, but not all of them. But Angel Island is a little bit different because we associate so much with the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the process there, especially Chinese immigrants, were detained for much, much longer at Angel Island, and far more of them were, it wasn't 2% rejection rate. I think it was more like 25% rejection rate at Angel Island. I'd have to look at that, but I think that's about right. So it's very different. It was not quite what was going on at Ellis Island, and most of that had to do with the Chinese Exclusion Act. The internment of Japanese is a little different. That's really a wartime measure. The West Coast internment of Japanese Americans is not done through the immigration system or the immigration laws. It's done purely through the U.S. War Department. It's a military, it's a military concentration of and detention of not just Japanese immigrants, but also Japanese Americans, those who were born here. That was done under the military during wartime.
And then I had a question going back to the steamboats and doing the screening, the steamship companies, I guess, doing the screening before they ever got to them, before the immigrants got to America. Did the steamships, to your knowledge, try to help educate the immigrants when they were on their way over what to expect when they got to America, and play any part in any sort of assimilation education? Because we actually, because Mr. Gillespie's came over through Ellis Island, someone gave us one time a framed sign that said advice to Irish immigrants that they said was hanging in the steamships. And it's a few paragraphs long, but one of the paragraphs says, "In the remote parts of America, an industrious youth may follow any occupation without being looked down upon or sustain loss of character, and he may rationally expect to raise himself in the world by his labor." In other words, trying to inspire immigrants that were coming over that if they worked hard, they could find success in their new country. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, remember, some of it was, as I mentioned earlier, an attempt to sort of drum up business, to get people to make the trip over, to buy the steamship tickets. So I can kind of see that as part of that. You know, come on, a new life is waiting for you. If you do all the right things, you'll be able to, you'll have a better life. They also let immigrants know about what they expected at Ellis Island. They knew, who would not be admitted. So there was a lot of knowledge about the process. But yeah, that what you told me wouldn't surprise me in terms of the steamship companies trying to drum up business and convince people to make the trip over to America.
Okay. Janine, did you say you had another question that you wanted to ask?
Well, I do. And Professor Canado, you've been wonderful today. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
This is fantastic. How many people, and I hope this didn't happen and I had to step off of the call, but how many people are let in today? Say if we're comparing apples and apples to the Ellis Island, which isn't necessarily a naturalization process, but it's a port of entry, you're allowed in legally. So how many people are allowed in legally today compared to how many people were? Because I know you said in 1 year there were 1 million in 1 year. And then I've heard some figures tossed out there, but I haven't really caught them. And people think we're not letting people in today. We don't let anybody in, but we actually do. And so how many people are let in today in comparison?
About a million. We average about 1 million a year for at least the last 20 plus years. Now, we're a bigger country, so as a percentage of the overall population, it's probably less than it was in the early 1900s, but it's still a lot. We've had 20 plus years of 1 million immigrants coming in. So yeah,
and that doesn't mean they're naturalized. It just means we've allowed them to come into what, on a green card? What does that mean exactly?
Yeah, a green card. They're naturalization is a completely separate process. I mean, you can come in as an immigrant and never get naturalized, and live the rest of your life in America. That does happen. We're just talking about entering the country. So yeah, it's 1 million people a year just entering the country on a green card, on a visa, and they become permanent residents.
When you're allowed in legally in this country, a lot of times we think that means, well, you're allowed in illegally, but so you could stay here the rest of your life for 20, 30, 40 years if you can keep getting your green card renewed.
If you're a permanent resident, if you have permanent resident status, you don't need to get anything renewed. You're a permanent resident.
And does that mean a green card?
No, I wouldn't say green card. I mean, it's permanent. It's called permanent resident status. I think that is a green card. I don't think it needs to be renewed. You're talking about visas need to be renewed, like a student visa or a work visa. Those need to be, there are renewable visas, but then there's permanent resident status visas that don't need to be renewed.
Okay, I guess that's based on work or family or something.
Yeah, if you qualify for a permanent resident visa, either through family reunification, you have family here, through skilled labor, you qualify under skilled labor category, you're a refugee, for instance, that qualifies you for permanent resident status.
Okay, interesting. So about $1 million a year. That's what, and it seems to me what we need to do, what Congress needs to do, and all of us need to tell Congress to do, is to speed up the modern day legal process to let people come in a legal way. And that's just, so essentially what people are wanting. This is why it's interesting to have these conversations, and thank you so much. Because we know this, but we don't know this. It's great to have it gel in our minds. When people want to come in legally and they're having to wait 1.5 years, they're just waiting to get their green cards.
Yeah, they're waiting they're waiting to qualify for a visa to get into the country. Yeah.
That's interesting to me. So we need to speed up the green card aspect so people can come in legally and not feel they have to do it illegally.
Yeah, I mean, if they qualify, and I mean, the debates are about, do we let in more skilled workers, and do we want to skew the visas more towards skilled workers? I mean, there are sort of limits on the number of visas that you can give out in a year. There are some limits.
Which I guess
We've stopped but we've stopped more of because there's a lot of other parameters that we could judge by as well. I mean, the upholding of American ideals, because the skilled workers, when we talk about skilled workers, that also displaces American skilled workers. So there's an argument there, because then the middle class jobs become lower salaried as well. Because I mean, I know of one company where they hired Indian immigrants on visas as computer programmers. So then the entire industry is there in that company, that salary went down. So we think of it from the lower end all the time, but we forget the fact that wherever you let in the skilled worker in general, they're going to be working for less. So it's going to displace somebody.
That's the argument against expanding. Yeah.
But I don't know but I think, I mean, there may be a discussion that becomes uncomfortable about why not let in people who adhere to the American ideal, and whatever effect that they have, we're going to have a negative and positive effect somewhere, no matter what we do. But we could be able to get behind people who understand or will adhere to the principles of the Declaration.
Yeah, if you could figure out a way to do that.
So people that are coming in illegally don't actually have a job, but people who with a green card, they either need to have a job or family.
Right.
And that's
with the exception of refugees.
So our refugee dissident. So what we're saying is, if you want to come into this country with a green card, other than a political dissident, you have to have a job. You can't be reliant on the state. We do still say that.
In some ways, yeah, or family. You have to have family here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's okay. Is there anything else in the next 60 seconds you would like to share us? Or Aubry, do you have a question? A burning question, Aubry? Okay, is there anything you would like to share with us?
We touched on a lot of stuff. That was great. We covered a lot of material. Thank you for great questions.
Really fascinating and very thought-provoking. I don't know. I do think we need to tell our congressmen and women to speed up the process so people can do it legally if they want to. It should be done legally, but we speed up the process, not have people wait so long. Well, thank you, Professor Cannato. It's really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Sorry, Jewel didn't need to step on. Yeah, Jewel and Jordan.
I always forget that Zoom doesn't allow you to talk, so we can't all just say thank you at the same time.
True. Okay.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a great show, and thanks everyone for watching. Thanks, Kathy and Aubry, and we'll see you soon.